this December 16th, 2009 meeting of the Creeks Advisory Committee to order. Julie, could you call the roll to make sure a quorum is present?
Mr. Jordan? Ms. Lomas? Mr. Moldaver?
Here.
Mr. Schluter? Here. Mr. Wilson? Ms. Falcone? Mr. Hockman? Mr. Justice?
Yeah. Thank you. It appears a quorum is present, so we'll go forward with the meeting, and we'll extend our heartiest holiday wishes to Councilwoman Falcone and Commissioners Hockman and Jostes. Item number 3 is the approval of the draft minutes from the meeting of November 18th, which were attached in the packet. Has everyone had a chance to review the draft minutes, and are there any corrections or amendments? Hearing none, is there a motion to accept the draft minutes as submitted? So moved. Is there a second? Second. All right, it's been moved and seconded to accept the draft minutes of the November 18th meeting. Any corrections, Mr. Jordan? No. Okay, all those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, there's one abstention, so the minutes are accepted by a vote of 4-0 with one abstention. That brings us to item number 4, adjustments to the agenda. Mr. Benson, any changes proposed for tonight's agenda?
No changes, Mr. Chair, but I would like to make a quick announcement. Yesterday, the City Council made appointments to this committee and to various commissions throughout the city. A new member was appointed to this committee who will start in January. Her name is Betsy Weber, and she will be here for the January 13th meeting. At the same time, one of our longstanding committee members on this committee, Michael Jordan, was appointed to serve as a city planning commissioner. And so I wanted to congratulate him for that. And he's been on this committee for many, many years now. I actually served with him when I was a member of this committee back in, about 5 years ago. And so I wish him well on the Planning Commission. He does plan to be not only at this meeting tonight, but at our January 13th meeting as well. But as you all remember, at our last meeting, Mr. Jordan was elected to be vice chair of the committee, meaning he would have taken over as chair of the committee in January, and he is unable to serve on both the Planning Commission and this committee. So at our January meeting, we don't have anything noticed tonight, so we can't take any action on that tonight, but at our January meeting, we will have on the agenda an item to elect a chair and vice chair, and Chair Moldaver has graciously volunteered to serve as chair for that January meeting until a new chair is selected.
Thank you. I think we all join with Mr. Benson in congratulating Mr. Jordan. It'll be very, very difficult, as good as Betsy Weber is, and she is very good, to do the kind of job and bring the kind of passion that Michael's brought to this committee for so many years. And okay. Any member of the public can address the committee for up to 1 minute on any subject within our jurisdiction that's not already listed on the agenda. We actually have a couple slips tonight. So first I'd like to call my former neighbors, Michelle and Gary Rosenfeld. Come forward and identify yourself for the record.
Hi, my name is Michelle Rosenfeld.
And my name is Gary Rosenfeld.
Thanks.
There you go.
We live at 615 Willow Glen in Santa Barbara, and we currently have a very big project in our yard. Our hill has been slipping in the creek for the last couple of years, and in October it had a big slippage, and we had called the county out, and the Fish and Game came out, and we had lots of people out, and finally the Army Corps engineers issued us an emergency permit because of the damage for the fire that was just up above us. And we're doing major creek hillside restabilization because it has slipped and it's continuing to slip. And we had no more plantings at all. I mean, everything had been washed away. It's completely barren. And so from a private owner, we didn't have there's no financial support for us. This is all on our own dime. And our insurance company doesn't cover any land movements, only damage to homes. So we called the creek committee, and they have this tree planting project. But they're not comfortable with planting trees inside the creek itself or do any kind of irrigation in there. So we're really not the candidate to be able to even get that. So for us financially, we have no support in that. And really what we're here to say is that we really just want to do the right thing. We want the creek to come back to its natural habitat. We want the flow of the creek to be correct and non-damaging to any of the other properties. And if any time in the future we can come up with a way to partner with private owners, because financially it's humongous. And we're doing the best we can, and we want to do the right thing. But it'd be nice if we could work together somehow to be able to do the right thing for our creeks for the future, because just having one person work on that one parcel of the creek isn't enough to really ensure that the creek's going to, flourish and come back to the way it really should be. We need help. We can't do that all on our own. So I just want to say thank you for having some part. I wish we could have more help, and that's. I don't know if you have anything else to say.
Additionally, I just think that it's unfortunate there's not more support for all the residents along the creek. If there's serious and sincere desire to return the creek to its natural endemic condition, it's not being shown. We're not getting the support, and obviously financially it's a huge burden on each individual homeowner that backs up to that creek.
But we're doing the right thing, and hopefully people will come by and see what we've done. And so thank you. That's all we have to say.
I want to really thank you for taking some time during the dinner hour to come down and share these thoughts. I don't know if you've had a chance to go to the website or followed previous meetings, but one of the big challenges for this program, where there is some money to get plants to be installed, is just as you said, trying to get a critical enough mass of large number of residents along a particular section of creek where they can do enough installation concurrently to actually make a difference over time. And we're not allowed to take up items under public comment on the current agenda, but I know this is something Mr. Benson and his entire staff have been giving a lot of thought to for the last couple of years, and I know our subcommittee has as well, like what's the best way to do this. And so I really appreciate your interest and enthusiasm, and if we can find a way to get a large number of neighbors along a particular creek area, I think that program still could someday work for you and for your neighbors.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and best holiday wishes to you. Thanks.
To you all too.
Thank you.
And is Eddie still here? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see you. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, this isn't for public comment?
It's for item number 7B.
No, is my fault. All right, is there anyone else here for public comment on creek-related items that are not on today's agenda? All right, that would then complete item number 5, and bring it over to item number 6, committee member and staff communications. Cameron, do you have anything to add to that?
No.
Yeah, Daniel?
Thank you, Chair. Appreciate it. I just want to express our gratitude for you guys taking time out of your day and coming down here and speaking to the committee. And Mr. Harris, look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you for coming down as well. I just sending a call out there to anyone who may be watching in TV land that we really do want you to come down here and communicate with us. And if you are not able to do so, take the time out of your day and physically come down here, communicate directly with staff, Creeks Division 897-2508. (897-28) 2658 897-2658, or go to sbcreeks.com. It's really important that we do hear from you. We live in a community here together and just really want to encourage community participation and community dollars. So thank you guys for coming down, and the other folks out there, please keep in touch with us so we can keep in touch with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. If there's nothing else on item number 6, that would bring us to item number 7, the major business items. Major business items on today's agenda, and the first is a presentation from Jim Rumbley, our code enforcement officer, with an update on enforcement issues. You may recall there were a number of questions about that at the last meeting, so this will be a tremendous opportunity to find out more. And let me turn it over then to Jim.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For this presentation, I'm going to talk about the Creeks Enforcement Program. I'll give an introduction to the process that we follow for the enforcement program and give some statistics on previous year's cases as well as this year's cases. So the objective of our enforcement program is to essentially identify and eliminate sources of water pollution to the city's streets, storm drains, creeks, and the ocean. There are several sections of the Municipal Code that help us with this, and there's 2 types of cases that we see primarily with the enforcement program. We enforce on illicit discharges and creek obstructions. Illicit discharges more so than creek obstructions, but Chapter 16 deals with water pollution prohibited, and this gives us the authority to enforce on illicit discharges. And essentially what Chapter 16 says is that it's generally a violation to put anything other than clean water into the city's storm drain system and into our creeks and ocean as well. Chapter 14, which deals with the natural water courses and storm drain system, is where we get the authority to enforce on creek obstructions. And now, creek obstructions can be several things. Most commonly, the enforcement cases that we see are vegetation, people who have cut trees and dumped them in the creeks. But it can also be trash, in very rare cases, structures that are built, and sometimes the creeks are filled in as well. And basically anything that can obstruct the natural flow of water in a creek or storm drain can be considered an obstruction. Now there are some types of exempt discharges. These are items that are exempt, or actions that are exempt from prohibition under Chapter 16. And you see there that uncontaminated is a qualification for these discharges to be exempt. Contamination is defined in the Municipal Code, and it's really, and I paraphrase, an impairment of water by waste to the degree which creates a hazard to the public health through poisoning or through the spread of disease. Now, I'm not going to talk about all of these discharges, but a couple of them I will say a little more about. We do get some calls about residential car washing. And although that is an exempt discharge, if we get a call about it, I'll commonly go out and speak with the person who's washing their car and tell them that it is exempt, but we would love it if they would try to capture that water, put it in their landscaping, or capture it with a wet vacuum and put it into the sewer. Same thing with street washing. We get a lot of calls about people washing off the sidewalk or the street. And for the most part, that is exempt if it's uncontaminated. And when I get a call like that, I will talk to people and say, we really encourage you to capture that water. If you can capture it and put it. Sure. Yeah. Use a broom. So for the coordination of enforcement, we get a lot of calls from residents, but we also get calls from other city staff. A lot of our calls come from city staff and Creeks Division staff. And also, if I'm out in the field a lot, if I see a violation, I'll stop and talk to the person and create an enforcement case if necessary. We do have an enforcement line that is monitored during Creek's regular business hours, which are 8 to 6 Monday through Thursday and 8 to 5 every other Friday. This is my primary line, 897-2688, and if I'm out in the field, I'll forward this line to my cell phone. Most of the time during business hours, a live person will answer this line. I'm the primary code enforcement officer for the Creeks Division, and I do try to handle most of the cases that come in. Occasionally, though, there's multiple cases that come in at the same time, or I'm out, and we have other staff members that are available to back me up, and they're trained and ready to contribute whenever needed. We commonly will coordinate with other city divisions and the county on enforcement. For the county, a lot of times they'll get calls that are actually in the city, and they'll transfer those over to us, and vice versa. Other city divisions have enforcement staff, and when they see violations in addition to the ones they're out there for, they'll contact me, and we'll create an enforcement case for those violations as well and coordinate. It's really our goal to investigate all the calls that we receive on the same day that we receive them. If we can get out there and find the person who's doing it while they're doing it, it makes enforcement a lot easier, and it's easier to deter that from happening again. So far this year, in fiscal year 2010, we've been able to get out to the calls on the same day, 92% of the time, and by the next business day, 97% of all calls. When we do see a violation, what we try to do is stop that discharge as fast as possible, and if possible, require the person that we find that's responsible to clean it up. Our goal really isn't to fine people, although that does happen. We really want to educate the person that's discharging and prevent it from happening again. We're still encountering a lot of people that don't realize there's a difference between where water goes in the storm drain and in the sewer. They think it just all gets treated. A lot of people really just don't know that. When we do see a violation, we send a notice of violation. And whether that is a warning letter or a fine depends on whether it's happened within the last 12 months. If it's the first offense within 12 months, it's a warning letter. We send out a warning letter. However, if this is a repeat offense within 12 months, they can receive an automatic fine of up to $250, and I'll talk more about that in a minute or so. Abatement deadlines. For cases that are an obstruction case or cleanup is required, if we're not able to get the discharge cleaned up while the enforcement officer is on site, when I send that notice of violation, there'll be an abatement deadline. And this is a deadline that could be between 2 and 7 days, depending on how long it's going to take for this to get cleaned up, how big of a job it is. If it's an obstruction, if it's a big tree, it's going to take some time to get that cleaned up. But if they miss those abatement deadlines, a citation will be issued. And here's a table that details the fine structure that we go through, depending on whether it's a first offense, second offense, or third offense. First offenses always get a warning letter, and these warning letters go to the property owner. All these letters go to the property owner, and they're ultimately responsible for paying any fines. But contractors or tenants are also copied on the letter if that's relevant. So first offense gets a warning letter, and if there is an abatement deadline accompanying that warning letter, and that abatement deadline is missed, that's a $100 fine. if, or with that $100 fine, another abatement deadline will be issued. And at that point, if that deadline's missed, it's $100 per day. And eventually, the case can be turned over to either the city attorney or the regional water board if deadlines continue to go unmet. For a second offense within 12 months, there is no warning. If this is a repeated offense, it's a $200 automatic fine. And if there's an abatement deadline issued with that fine, it goes to $200 per day. With the third offense, the initial fine goes up to $250. That's the maximum initial fine we can issue. After that, it's $250 a day. Some exceptions. Many cases, or many calls that we get, we don't end up issuing a notice of violation. And there's several reasons for this. One is that we may go out and not find a violation. We get a call and there's no violation that we can find. Other times we'll see get a report of a discharge and find that it's an exempt type of discharge. It's someone washing their car or sidewalk washing, and a notice of violation is not appropriate. There are some cases where we just don't find the discharge, or we go out and we see that someone's dumped paint or something in the gutter, but we don't know who's responsible. So a notice of violation is an issue. And then other cases or calls fall in another jurisdiction or outside the city, in the county mostly. We transfer a lot of calls to the county. This is a table that has some data from previous fiscal years and so far this fiscal year. In 2008, we received 290 reports of violations, and of those 290, 70 notices of violation were issued, and that includes 5 citations. Of that 290, 224 of those received enforcement on the same day. In 2009, 190 reported violations were received. 58 notices of violation were issued, including 3 citations. And of those 190 reports, 136 of those received enforcement on the same day. So far this fiscal year, we've received 91 calls, reports of violations, and 38 notices of violation, including 5 citations, have been issued. And of those 91, 84 of those received enforcement on the same day. And although I don't have a slide for it, I did go ahead and break down some enforcement data for this year regarding calls that didn't receive notices of violation. 53 of the 91 calls did not result in a notice of violation. And of those 53 calls, 37 of those were either no discharge or obstruction, or it was an exempt type of discharge. 9 of those 53, the discharger couldn't be found. 6 of those cases ended up being transferred to another division or agency, and 1 of these cases is still ongoing. We're waiting for additional information from the complaining party. So that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Great presentation. I know several of the committee members had questions. Daniel, do you want to start?
Thanks, Chair. Smooth presentation. Thanks. Very clear. Curious about the cases that were referred to other agencies, or other jurisdictions. Is that typically the Regional Water Quality Control Board?
Most of the time, almost all the time, it's the county. People will call us, and it's just not in the city.
Not in the city. Okay.
And we'll give them the Project Clean Water's phone number, or if it's a message, we can transfer that ourselves.
Any idea how the Project Clean Water folks, what their follow-up stats look like as far as communication or NOV, notice of violation, or citation?
Yeah, I really don't know much about that. My contact over there is Kathleen Garnand. I
Great.
will email or call her.
And then just sort of a minor question. People draining their pools, which actually see quite frequently, or spas.
Yeah.
I noticed that was not on the exemption list.
Nope.
I'm assuming that's because of chlorine and bromine and other
Copper. Yeah.
copper.
Chlorine.
Mhm.
Some people use copper to fight algae. Yeah, that's not an exempt discharge. That if we see somebody discharging their pool, that's a notice of violation.
Okay, it's good to know. I see it actually quite a bit, and I think before I was on the Creeks Committee, maybe many years ago, I called somebody in the city, hey, this guy's discharging their pool. Oh, we know, he does it all the time. That was, 8 years ago, so we've all become more educated now. Anyways,
Yeah, if you see it, give me a call.
thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks, Chair. I did have one other question. I'm just wondering, don't need anything specific, just general in nature. What sort of proportion or percentage, approximately, of the calls are construction related, and what percentage are, I guess, more or less just sort of single family homeowner kind of doing their thing? Just sort of ballpark to get
I
an
would
idea.
say, as far as construction goes, very few. I've been here since May of 09. That's when I started, and I would say maybe one or two of the 100+ calls that I've received are construction related. Residential versus commercial, maybe 60% commercial, 40% residential, an estimate. I could get you some more solid numbers.
The general numbers are great, and that's actually really great information to have. Nice to know about the construction. I will say it would be great maybe in springtime if even yourself can come back or just kind of get an idea actually after a winter rains what that may look like, because sedimentation and other issues would be, I think, of interest.
I would just add to that most of the time it's not raining in Santa Barbara, and so we're dealing with sort of nuisance discharges, and what you just said makes me think you might have been referring to a stormwater discharge, and that might be different. Still a violation, but it might be different. One other thing I was going to say is, for those nuisance discharges, larger construction sites tend to have a lot of containment best management practices in place on their construction site. What we do see more of is smaller time construction. You're not talking about a major construction project, but somebody's doing a little bit of concrete work in their yard, or they're painting either interior or exterior of a home or business, and then you have the subcontractor or the painters washing out brushes in the gutter, or somebody's washing out a concrete tub in the gutter. Small time construction projects, but not a big construction site.
Specifically, what I was curious about was paint and cement. Thanks.
Mr. Jordan, you had a question?
Sure, Mr. Chair, thank you. I got a bunch of questions. We love enforcement. I would echo Daniel's comment on the types of the notice of violations you've issued. On the general ones, like you showed 38, and then past years so-and-so. That also has implications when we're thinking about outreach. If you would, in the future, maybe categorize those, however you want to define nuisance versus non-nuisance or something. If 90% of them are pools, or 90% of them are soapy dogs or whatever, then that tends to stick in our brain a little bit when we get together in subcommittees and talk about outreach and education plans too, other than just they were general notice of violations.
Yeah.
Questions. Is there absolutely no recourse after hours, after 5:30 or on the weekend? I mean, literally, if you're driving up Chapala behind a large retail mall and you see the paint contractors at 5:45 washing out their paint buckets in Chapala, I mean, are we just kind of out of luck?
Well, I mean, not necessarily. As far as a notice of violation goes, possibly. If you can get us pictures and a solid report of a company, I can contact them later and, maybe not issue a notice of violation, but certainly try to educate them about what they should be doing right.
Okay. That's good. That's a good alternative then, I think. Yeah. And then I think I just had a couple comments, if I could make a couple comments. One, I'm struck with and it's just comments on the way out, I guess. But, you know, because I know this is all mired over in the municipal code and everything else, but the relatively small increase by the time you get to the third infraction seems pretty small. That, you know, by the time we're slapping a guy for the third time, you're only increasing the fine $50. You went from 100 to 200 the first one, and now you're only increasing it a small amount. Just seems, I don't know, counterproductive to me. And I know I'm lighting the fire under Mr. Wilson right there. I heard it. So, but it just seems by the time you get to that point, the guys had the person or people have plenty of opportunity to take care of that. And then, I found a couple more questions.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to just respond to that.
Sure.
Well, it's since you brought that up, as I think most of you are aware, in the city's stormwater management program, which is actually a stormwater discharge permit that's approved by the Regional Water Quality Control Board under the Federal Clean Water Act, the city is required to develop a stormwater ordinance, and part of that ordinance development that the regional board has requested is an examination of that stepped fine structure, and we will be over the next calendar year developing a draft stormwater ordinance, and it will be coming to the committee for we'll probably have a subcommittee working on it, but it will come to the full committee for input as well.
Okay. And then, you know, one of my other frustrations, as Cameron knows, is when I walk up and down State Street at lunchtime and you see an outlet pipe there in the, whatever, 100 block of State Street, and you look up and you're just looking at a block full of retail concrete, and how do you identify where it's coming from, although it's obviously soapy something water coming out of that drain. Are there other actions that we take, you know, like when they go around annually and check for connections to roof gutters into the sewage system? Are we able to do smoke tests or something like that to begin to knock those down if we can, if we think that it's a recurring problem at a particular block?
I mean, that's not something that we've done. I don't see why that wouldn't be possible. I know that dye tests are certainly possible. Wastewater has done dye tests to figure out, you know, where sewage is coming from.
I see Cameron queuing up too, so you can help me if that's the right way to phrase that or not.
Yeah, I would just add that, you know, the pipe systems throughout the city are incredibly complex and have been built over the last 150 years. And usually when we see water flowing out of one of those pipes, it takes some time to do the CSI work and investigate the source of that, but usually we're able to find it. We've had a couple of rare occasions, I think, where we have not been able to find where the water's coming from. But we will, Jim or one of our water resources staff will go out and really investigate, and generally we'll find where the water's coming from, and we're able to do an enforcement action if that's appropriate. We actually have had 2 instances in the past year where we found an illegal connection of a sewer lateral from a building to the storm drain system. So we had 2 commercial buildings that actually had toilets connected to the storm drain system, so that was flowing out into the creek untreated and out into the ocean, and obviously address that right away.
And it's just, as you know, it has nothing to do with the big picture on what really affects the big picture, but it's just so frustrating when it's downtown core area and very publicly noticed by a lot of people, and then it's frustrating not to be able to put your finger on that. You know, it might be less damaging than something out in a neighborhood on the Mesa where nobody notices it, but the fact that it's there and then pooling in every block as you come down State Street just kind of makes it one of those obnoxious frustrations that you want to put your finger on.
Yeah.
So.
One other thing that I've done in the past for situations like that is if we can figure out what parcel it's attached to, we can find a contact. I've called property managers to come down there. Hey, we've got an illicit discharge happening right now. Can you meet me here? And we've had good success with getting access to the building and potentially seeing where that's coming from.
Okay, and I guess really the only reason I talk about that is, as Daniel and I talk about it now and then, is one of our goals is that just more people play a role in getting involved in that. So I think the more we talk about being water narcs, that maybe that will wear off on some of the other people out there, that it's not just, you're not just beating your head up against a bureaucratic wall, that they're actually, if you see something and report it, there are actually steps that we'll take to prevent that in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And Roger, you had a couple questions and comments?
Yeah, I just have a couple minor questions. The first one is, you indicated that not infrequently you can't find a discharger. What happens in those circumstances? Does the city have crews to clean up? What happens?
The streets division will help us sometimes to get it cleaned up.
Sometimes?
Depending on what type of mess it is. We've had gasoline spills where the fire department will show up and contain, keep that discharge from going into the storm drain system. And I know that the city facilities division has very limited funds to clean that mess up.
Okay.
So that's another option.
And maybe this is a question for Cameron. I just assume that the fine structure is written hardwired into the municipal codes.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. My other question is, in your coordinating enforcement, two of the areas are city and county staff. Are you satisfied that they have an eye out for what a violation is occurring? Do you do any training, or is even training necessary? In other words, are the other people who report to you, do you think you're catching most of the stuff they see?
Well, the city staff do receive training each year. It's a requirement in our stormwater management plan. And the calls that I receive are pretty knowledgeable from pretty knowledgeable people who seem to know that what a violation is.
Does county staff get training of any kind? Do you know?
Not from us. I don't believe they do get training from us.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just gonna add to that the Creeks Division does provide training to all of the city's operational divisions, and it generally takes us several months. We usually do that in the spring, and that's the purpose for that is twofold. One is those are the people who are out in the field in terms of reporting violations they may see in the field. Also, importantly, they receive the training so that the city staff is not responsible for the violations in the first place, and some of these things are not necessarily intuitive to people, and so that's part of the educational process. And we've been doing the trainings now for several years, and I've seen a really marked improvement among the city staff, both in their own operations as well as in reporting things that they're seeing happening throughout the city.
In that light, then, the only thing I could suggest would be to check with the county to see if they have a training program. Can you help? You've got training materials. Make sure that the eyes that are out there are doing the best they can. Thanks.
Once again, thank you for a good report. When you go out there and you see that people are hosing down their sidewalk instead of brooming it up and collecting with a dustpan, or washing their car in their driveway or on their front lawn, do you ever remind them that Allison Jordan is a ferocious water conservation warrior, and although you won't cite them, they should be aware that water is a very precious, expensive, scarce resource, and that using water to wash a sidewalk or a street. And I think we've talked about this before since the first days of the committee about why washing cars at home is not regulated, but commercial car washes are, because the asbestos coming off of the wheel linings and the chemicals coming out are just as toxic when you take the cumulative of a lot of home washes as they are coming out of a wash. But I think the politics for strict enforcement just isn't there right now.
Yeah, I would agree. No, and to answer your question, no, I don't usually mention the a waste of water, but I should. It's a good point.
Because most years the city is pursuing active water conservation programs. Actually, Allison's office is just up the hall here in the Public Works Department, and anytime people, and that's the whole genesis of our partnership on the rain barrel collection program, is anytime we can save water or avoid using it unnecessarily, that's a long-term plus for all the residents and businesses and visitors to the city, because drought is cyclical and serious here, and most people really don't need to use their water that way. But thank you again for a great report, and from everything I've heard, you're off to a great start with this, so we're very lucky to have you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah. Daniel?
Thanks, Chair. I actually want to compliment your comment there. It was actually well played. Just a final thought is you might consider either pricing out a camera or establishing a relationship with a plumbing contractor, somebody who does have a camera that would be available on call. And I think that if you was to, say, come before this committee with a proposal to purchase a $2,000 or $3,000 camera that had a traceable 100-foot extension on it, this committee would probably look reasonably favorable upon that as a one-time purchase that could be used for many years for information gathering for enforcement. Of course, I just speak on my own, but you might just consider that.
Mr. Chair. Mr. Wilson?
Cameron?
Thank you. Mr. Wilson, are you talking about a camera to TV pipes, lines? We generally work with the city's wastewater division on that. They have cameras that they use for TVing the sewer lines. They're also able to TV storm drain lines and various pipes. And generally speaking, they're readily available, and we can get them to get out and TV a line. Thanks.
If there are no other questions for Jim, that would complete item 7A on an update on enforcement. And best wishes to you also for safe and happy holidays. And
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As you all know, Measure B was passed in November 2000 by voters in the city of Santa Barbara. The measure increased the city's transient occupancy tax, also known as the hotel bed tax, by 2%, and restricted and directed those additional funds to be raised to be used for programs to improve stormwater quality, surface water quality, creek restoration efforts, and other projects and programs to improve the quality of onshore and offshore waters. And I included with my report a copy of the actual ordinance language, so you'd be able to take a look at that. Well, soon after that ordinance was passed and the Creeks Division was established, it became apparent that written guidelines were needed to ensure that the expenditure of Measure B funds remained consistent and true to the intent of Measure B into the future. And so city staff and this committee spent a considerable amount of time and effort to develop the Creeks program funding guidelines. Those guidelines were presented to the City Council and adopted in April of 2003. And I attached a copy of the cover letter and those guidelines that were established by the committee and approved by the City Council. Since being approved, the guidelines have been a very useful tool for Creeks Division and for this committee in making decisions for the use of Measure B funds. We all consistently refer to the guidelines as we're preparing annual budgets and preparing capital improvement programs to ensure that that all of our projects and programs are consistent both with the letter of the ordinance as well as the intent of the voters who passed the measure. And the Creeks Division also refers members of the public and other agencies to the guidelines if they come to us with any kind of funding requests, so that they can consider the consistency with the guidelines and the use of the funds before proposing a specific project or use of funds. So last June, during the City Council's deliberation on the fiscal year 2010 budget, one of the council members suggested revisiting the approved Measure B funding guidelines in light of the current economic downturn and corresponding decrease in TOT revenues. And specifically, the council member raised a question about whether Measure B funds should be used to supplant funds for an existing general fund program. The council member had at that time requested the committee's feedback. I brought the matter to the committee for its May meeting. Actually, this issue was raised in May. I think I just said June, but it was raised in May. I brought it to the committee just a few days later. The committee briefly discussed the issue at its May 13th meeting and generally concluded that proposal violated the intent and the spirit of Measure B because it was using Measure B funds to backfill an existing city program. And at that time, a number of the committee members had requested, that this was a very significant item, very important item for discussion, and requested that it come back to the full committee as a noticed agenda item. And so here we are tonight to be able to have a full discussion about that. I wanted to include in here my impression. I've worked very closely with these guidelines over the last several years as a committee member at one time and then as the manager of the Creeks Division. I feel that the existing funding guidelines have served the program and the community well. The guidelines are clear and comprehensive. They're consistent with the ordinance, and they reflect the intent of the voting public who supported the passage of Measure B. And for those reasons, I have made a recommendation that the committee tonight reaffirm the existing Creeks program funding guidelines. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Benson. Very excellent, succinct, focused report. For the sake of discussion, before I call members of the public who filled out slips to speak on this issue, is there anyone who'd like to make a motion to recommend council reconfirm and reauthorize the existing guidelines as outlined by Mr. Benson and within your packet? Don't all speak at once, Mr. Jordan, this being your last meeting. Well, I always feel like it's good to have a motion on the floor that we're discussing, because it keeps us kind of focused rather than general discussion. Oh, okay. Why don't you start, Mr. Wilson? Well, I thought it'd be easier to wait for public comment until we had a motion. So, but would you prefer to hear from the public first? Okay, Mr. Harris.
And I've got a green light here, so okay. We're a 501c3 nonprofit, and we've been doing work here on the South Coast with the focus of protecting watersheds and encouraging strategies that would lead to reduction in pollution. We've been an advocate for the formation of this committee and for helping to pass the Measure B, which provides funding for the program. and we've been working on the South Coast, as I think I said, since around 1990. So without going into too much history on that, for those of you that don't know or aren't familiar with the Santa Barbara Urban Creeks Council, we do advocate for clean water, and we do work that promotes restoration of habitat, and we've been involved in doing this for a long time. And we're encouraging you to maintain the current Creeks program funding guidelines. And I think that the current guidelines do provide clear direction to the council and for determining the appropriate use of Measure B funds. The guidelines are pretty well written as they are. And I think most people agree that the successes that the Creeks Division have chalked up in the past reflect that those guidelines are appropriate. And there's been work in Bonnet Park, work done at Henry's Beach, and other places. And I've seen other planning efforts that are currently in place that are going to lead to some more successes for the program and for the Creeks Division and for the community. And so I'm here in support of the current guidelines, and I hope that you will see that the current guidelines work, and that if they're tweaked in a way that would subtract funding from the program, I think that it would lead to a jeopardization of a good program that's well funded, the guidelines are appropriate, and it would be a detrimental and perhaps would jeopardize the mission of the Creeks program. So that's my input on it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Harris, and thank you, Urban Creeks Council. You do wonderful work. Mr. Jordan, question or comment?
Nope. Oh, I'm ready to jump in now that you prompted me.
Mr. Chair. Mr. Benson?
Yeah, before we jump away from public comment, I just wanted to say that I did receive
I was working my way over toward Mr. Trautwein and
an email comment as part of the public comment from somebody who was unable to be here tonight, and I passed a copy out to everyone on the committee. This is from Bryan Trautwein of the Environmental Defense Center. I don't want to. He wrote quite a lengthy email, but I think I can summarize it by a couple of sentences he's placed in here. We find the guidelines to be appropriate parameters for fulfilling Measure B 2000's intent, cleaning up our creeks and the ocean. And then he sums up by saying, he goes through several points within the guidelines and the criteria found in the guidelines, and concludes that the scope is appropriate considering the intent of Measure B and to the voters who overwhelmingly passed it in November 2000. And so I would just enter this into the record, and I think all of the committee members have a copy, and we have copies available for members of the public as well.
Thank you, Mr. Benson. I think people who have been in the community for a while know that no one has worked harder or more effectively for creeks in the South Coast than Bryan Trautwein, who is the co-founder of the local chapter of the Urban Creeks Council. And this is a wonderful memo from him, and when his associate Betsy Weber takes her place on the committee in a few weeks, I'm sure she'll be able to express similar thoughts, whether Brian's here or not. But we really appreciate always Mr. Trautwein's input, and there's always a lot of thought behind it. So thanks, and we'll make sure that it's entered in the official record. Mr. Jordan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have any questions, so I guess I'm going to get to your prompting for a motion, but I have a couple comments. And one, I just jumped through this process with another group I'm associated with, as you know, because we shared information, and I'm a little disturbed, I guess, because this forum tonight is more of a defensive exercise. I see it rather than a proactive, ongoing exercise. So that would be, I guess, one of my initial suggestions is that probably there should be a certain cycle of years where this would come back to the committee as a regular discussion or even a work session item. Circumstances are dynamic in the city. They change, issues change, priorities change, and I support the guidelines as they are now and in the future, or going forward in the future, but you don't know what the future is going to be. And I think to have these discussed, whatever period of time you wanted to say, 5 years, every 5 years as a major item on the agenda, would give an opportunity for a different group of 7 people to look at it, in that time sphere of what's going on in the city, and so forth. But one of the documents that I know is not in here that's causing a little bit of a fuss out in my world is the actual ballot language, and the belief that there is the word beach mentioned in the ballot language. And you don't have to look for it, because I know the word beach is not mentioned in the ballot language, and the closest that comes to it is, I believe, the phrase ocean waters, either ocean or ocean waters. And I think clearly some of the traction that's gained by Councilmember Falcone's statement on working on beach grooming and beach raking is partly our fault, with the lack of education and outreach on these guidelines and what the original language in the ballot structure was. That there is a group or a set of beliefs out there that beach was mentioned in that ballot language, and I don't think that's true. So I think from the lesson from that is that there is some outreach work to do, some education to do, and that would benefit from keeping this being a defensive act rather than a proactive act. I also think that it's unfortunate that poor financial times are when this type of discussion comes up, and I think it would be much more beneficial and to the process if this discussion were to take place when everybody was flush with financial capabilities. That there's too many people looking at the funds that are generated for specific purposes within specific parameter, and seeing what has been a responsible use and a savings of those funds as something to be plucked off. And it would be much more honest conversation if this process took place, not in this economic climate, but in one that was much more favorable to everybody. And then, in my opinion, again, I think that there's adequate flexibility built into these guidelines, that they provide the needed amount of guidance, and they have as both Mr. Trautwein, Mr. Harris, and as you have said, they have provided us with an almost 10-year history of accomplishments that can just be continued to be built on in the future. And so when you're ready, Mr. Chair, with lack of discussion, I will be happy to make that motion.
Well, you can make it now if the spirit moves you.
I'm going to have to go back and grab your blue sheet then. So I would move that the committee...
7B2.
Thank you. The committee approve the staff recommendation to reaffirm the Creeks program funding guidelines as they are written.
Yeah. All right, it's been moved and seconded. Are there any comments, questions, or additions to the motion? Mr. Wilson?
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Jordan, I think what you said was very on point and well stated. I just, as a straw poll, I fully support the guidelines as written, and this isn't the time for wordsmithing. There's a however there, and after spending quite a few of the last few years interested and involved with the aspect of technical assistance, and having heard some public comment just this evening about the sort of technical difficulties of some homeowners of accessing some good use of some Measure B funds, and further looking at the guidelines, and no less and no more, but exactly 4 times there is stated in each of the categories some kind of technical assistance to either homeowners or businesses or architects or professionals. It's actually landowners several times here. I'd just like for everyone on this committee, if they would, to page 2 of the guidelines, just to look at one little point here. It's a pretty quick one. And I think this might actually be more of a proactive thing, such as Mr. Jordan was talking about. But the first paragraph is restoration. And this is actually the second page, so this is the second actually program. But restoration, the third point, technical assistance for landowners interested in native plant revegetation. And if we jumped all the way down to public information education, number 5, technical assistance to landowners with interest in restoring private property. And I think the intent is all pure and is all good, but public information and education is not the same thing as actual restoration. One is information and knowledge and communication, and the other one is actual implementation. And so back on restoration, number 3, I would like to suggest that this committee consider technical assistance for landowners interested in, just as it says down in public information education, restoring private property, not just plant revegetation, because there's a lot more to restoring land and creeks than just plant revegetation, which is a critical component. And I'm just afraid that if guidelines are so specific and that wordsmithing is so important, which our city attorney is so ever presently aware, and hence the creek tree program not allowing people to plant below top of bank on the banks and deal with the irrigation for fear of blowouts and so on and so forth, that if there's a way for this committee tonight to maybe include that addition, those couple words, I think that would be in the community's best interest.
Well, Mr. Jordan, you made a motion, and Mr. Schluter seconded it. Do you wish to amend your motion now, or is this something you'd like to see carried over for a future
like I want that
discussion?
burden on me my last night, right? I think the more appropriate thing would be that if there's some traction there, that next year one of the subcommittees in the first quarter or whatever gets together and plays with some of these points. I mean, so I'm because what I'm concerned about is this process ends up walking its way up the food chain to adoption by council. Am I right?
Well, I would, Mr. Chair, I'd respond to Mr. Wilson's comments that I think what he's looking for and suggesting is within the guidelines already, and I'm not sure that an amendment's necessary for that type of program. This committee's had extensive discussions about that type of program over several years. And the breadth of that type of program was narrowed through those discussions, not because of inconsistency with these guidelines, but for other reasons. And I think that type of program already is within the scope here and of the existing guidelines. I would also point out that in addition to the native creek tree planting program that we have, where the Creeks Division will go on to private property and will plant trees to help restore the native riparian canopy. We do have a lot of other technical assistance provided to the public in the form of through the technical guidance manual that the Creeks Division established for the city for all kinds of land development review, and it provides guidance, and we provided training to property owners, to engineers, landscape architects, and other professionals throughout the community. We are involved with development review and assistance with projects, with development projects that are going forward, and those documents contain everything from structural stability of banks to plant lists that people could select from. We also have a clean water business program where we work with local businesses, and we have a business assistance program, which is a small grant program to local businesses for technical compliance with water quality laws. And so we've got a pretty broad range, but I think the main point I want to make is that I think the program you envision, Mr. Wilson, is within the existing language already.
So you and Mr. Benson, that it's implicit and doesn't have to be explicit.
Yeah, is that a trick question? I think that I think that it's within the language that he mentioned in the restoration section, which is the technical assistance for landowners, as well as
that to me is what implicit would convey.
Okay, then yes.
Okay, and I think Mr. Wilson, you and Mr. Jordan are basically agreed, although you're coming at it from different directions. In 3 weeks, we're going to have a new mayor and 3 new members of the city council, and we're also going to have a new council liaison to this committee, and the economy and the budget are still going to be in a fragile state. So I think that all of these things that we've talked about today and so many times over the last few years are going to be raised again, both with the new council and in the new budget process, and here with the committee, especially since we're going to have Betsy coming on board, for next month's meeting as well. So I think there's absolutely no doubt that your recommendation to have a fuller discussion is going to be coming up in the coming year. So do you think you'd be able to support Mr. Jordan's motion as stated now?
Thanks, Chair. I just have one more thing that I need to say is that I think it's very clear that the Creeks Division has done a superb job and continues to do a superb job, and I believe that these guidelines are solid and definitely should continue. At no fault to the Creeks Division, however, the one aspect that has not succeeded yet, which I think is very significant, and I'll talk about it for a little bit more, not tonight, I'm just saying in general, and then I'm not really going to be talking about it much more, and that is that there has been a very underwhelming success or action in regards to collaboration or work with private property. And the low-hanging fruit of public property restoration projects, which are significant and critical for many different reasons, have been fantastic. And I think it's very important for this committee, and I'm addressing this comment to my committee members here, to consider the opportunity for the Creeks Division and the committee's ability to support Creeks Division to encourage the cultivation and actualization of projects on private property to whatever extent. And so it's possible that this discussion, the question is, should this discussion even happen now? Because I ask that because it's actually on the table and it's open and we're talking about it. And next year, who knows what the roster will be like and who knows what the agenda items will be like and the political climate, how that'll change. So this is an opportunity that sort of a passing comment of mine is, I definitely feel it's very important, irrespective if it's a called a technical assistance program or whatever it is. I really think that maybe the next decade that this committee and the Creeks Division, I hope, really heads in the direction of embracing partnerships with private property and landowners. And, you know, that's how we're really going to get to where we have steelhead swimming up these creeks. And so if this is not the night to talk about this, no problem, that's fine. So I definitely support it as written, and if I'm assured here that technically speaking and, you know, the city's attorney and all that will consider that assisting homeowners more than just with providing information, which again, there's no doubt the city has prepared excellent guidance information. But then again, people who are working 10-hour days and raising 3 kids may not necessarily have the ability or the interest or the energy to actually access that information, ask for it, know that it even exists, and actually read it. So again, I really think this Creeks Division role is to, in this next decade, is to really get out there and be more active. So I guess I'll leave it up to my committee, the fellow committee members, to see if there's, you know, any interest in pursuing this conversation any further tonight with this opportunity, or is this something that should be taken up next year, or is it already implicit as opposed to explicit? We don't need to discuss it next year, and we just move on, and everything is excellent as written, and it'll allow the ability for this committee to expand over the next decade. Thanks, Chair.
Well, I can't speak for the motion maker, but I certainly can point out that from Mr. Benson's presentation, you can see that the staff is enthusiastically aware of all the opportunities for community service and public partnership within the existing Measure B. I'd like to point out, I don't want the staff to have to do this, that, you know, what our staff indicates to us does not necessarily reflect or bind the city attorney's office and their interpretation of the law. So I know you just threw that in there for more support, but it's a different office and a different function. And I'd like to remind you that although your point really deserves to be discussed at greater length with its own agenda item, that people like Mr. Trautwein and Mr. Harris and the Urban Creeks Council, who were instrumental in the creation and campaigning for and approval of Measure B, are strongly supporting the motion before us now. So I think our first duty is in our last action of calendar 2009 and Mr. Jordan's last meeting is to send a very clear and unequivocal message that will greet the new council when they come in and are sworn in January. And I think the easiest way to do that is to approve the motion now. And given that there is a motion and a second, Roger?
I'd like to make just a couple of comments. One is with regard to Mr. Wilson's comment. I'm not a lawyer, obviously, but it says technical assistance for landowners who are interested in native plant restoration. It doesn't say native plant restoration with respect to what the committee does. It says native plant restoration with respect to the landowner. So the landowner may say native plant restoration, but that doesn't prevent, because it says simply technical assistance, that doesn't prevent them from advising on all other kinds of things. So I don't see a problem with the language. The other point I would just make in general is that I do like these guidelines, and I don't think that they should be, that a review should be triggered because we're either flush or because we're short. That the guidelines should be almost philosophical in nature, and then within those you adjust to the economic times, not the other way around. And that's why I'd like these guidelines to stay. Thank you.
Mr. Bullock, any last thoughts before the vote?
Yes, thanks, Mr. Chair. Just as a comment, that the Municipal Code has really 3 topics it talks about in regard to how the use of the tax proceeds will be used. The first is to fund programs to improve the quality of stormwater. The second is to carry out creek restoration improvements. And the third is for projects or programs to improve the quality of the waters. So 3 things sounds pretty simple, and we've created a really big a big machine to carry out those 3 things. And I think the guidelines are good, but it's just one way of looking at how to implement these, implement the monies to do those things. So I will agree with the guidelines at the moment, but I do think we should have the opportunity to review it in future years.
Good. Agreed. If there are no other questions or comments on Mr. Jordan's motion on 7B2 to reaffirm the Creek Program funding guidelines as written, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? Are there any abstentions? All right, let the record show that the committee has unanimously recommended to Council to reaffirm the Creek Program funding guidelines as written. And that brings us to item 9, which is in several parts. 9A, to look at the attachment that staff has given for a suggested meeting schedule for 2010. And you notice that the first 5 months are the regular meeting date we've had, the second Wednesday. And if you have any questions or issues with that schedule, please reply back to the staff. Part B is to congratulate again Mr. Jordan and wish him well on his new assignment with the Planning Commission. Section C is to wish all the members of the committee and the staff safe and happy holidays. And item D brings us to the question of adjournment. So is there a motion to that for part number 9? It's moved by Mr. Schluter. Is there a second? Seconded by Mr. Jordan. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed? Are there any abstentions? All right, the meeting is adjourned at 6:48. Happy holidays to one and all.